Last time, we began to think about how the economy functions, at least in the minds of Keynesians, and we saw this crucial idea that according to Keynesian theory, the market will adjust to a level of national output which may not be the level at which we have full employment of labour. So we have an unemployment equilibrium. And this gave the Keynesians grounds for saying that if the economy is going to run at a high level of employment all the time, governments will have to be involved in manipulating the volume of aggregate demand. Now, I want to develop that idea in two ways now. The first is to see why the classicals are not impressed with this argument, why they don't believe that's true. And then the second thing we'll do is to introduce inflation and see how the Keynesians and the classicals believe that the economy reacts to changes in the price level. But the first thing we're going to try to do is to understand why the classicals are not convinced about the argument that we put last time about an equilibrium level of unemployment. And we can see it in two ways. The first way is this. Think what the Keynesians must be saying. The economy is in equilibrium, but there's unemployment. There are people out there who want a job who are unable to get one. And the classicals say, this can't be right because the market will deal with the problem of unemployment. And we can see that very simply from a diagram. My diagram here is a supply and demand curve where the quantity is not the quantity of some good, like tomatoes, but the quantity of labour services. And up here, I've got the price of these labour services, which we call the wage rate, how much per hour people get for working for the firm. And the classicals say there is a downward sloping demand curve for labour services. The greater the wage rate, the less likely it is that firms will be willing to employ people. It won't be profitable to do so. So we've got a downward sloping demand curve for labour services in much the same way that we have a downward sloping demand curve for tomatoes. And we have an upward sloping supply curve for labour services. The higher the wage rate, the more willing people are to enter the labour market and offer their services. So we've got a downward sloping demand curve for labour, an upward sloping supply curve for labour. And say the classicals, what's the position if we have what the Keynesians call an unemployment equilibrium? Unemployment means an excess supply of labour. People are offering their services to the market, but there is no demand for some of that labour. In other words, it must be a position like this, where the wage rate, W, I might call it the real wage rate, the wage rate relative to the price level, where the wage rate, W, is up here, so that we have a quantity of labour services demanded by firms of this much. The quantity of labour services supplied by people in the economy wanting a job is out here somewhere. And this gap that we've labelled as A, B, represents an excess supply of labour. But now the classicals say this can't be equilibrium. If you have an excess supply of tomatoes, what happens to the price of tomatoes? The price is driven down to the equilibrium level here, where the quantity of tomatoes offered for sale is equal to the quantity of tomatoes demanded. Exactly the same thing will happen in the labour market. Real wages will fall as firms find that they can offer work at a lower wage rate the wage rate is lowered until the point at which everyone who is willing to work for that wage rate can get a job, because quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. There will be no unemployment, there will be no excess supply of labour when the market has adjusted. Now, the Keynesians say that's not how labour markets function. The labour market is not the same as the market for tomatoes. There are things which will prevent the labour market from lowering wage rates. For example, there may be trade union activity, so that trade unions are unwilling to accept a cut in real wages just because unemployment is rising. So the Keynesians say the market for labour services is different from tomatoes. Tomatoes don't have a union. It's not just that, there may be other reasons why firms are willing to operate with a wage rate above the equilibrium level. They may, when they compare paying this higher wage rate with sacking some labour and employing someone more cheaply, they may feel that the new employee will be less productive than the old one, simply because the existing employees have built up skills about how the firm functions and so on. So that labour is being offered a wage rate above the equilibrium level. Again, we have an argument that says the market for labour is not flexible, whereas the classicals say you may have some short-term unemployment, but as time goes on, the firms will wish to be profit maximising, and that means if they can offer a lower wage rate, they will. The market for labour services adjusts, and unemployment as a problem disappears. So one crucial difference between the Keynesians and the classicals is how quickly do labour markets adjust when there is a period of unemployment. Now, there's a second reason why the classicals don't go along with the Keynesian view about the market for labour. And we can see that if we go back to what we saw as the circular flow of income, develop that a little more, see how the Keynesians think through this issue in terms of the diagram, and then we'll see what the classical response is. So again, you'll pick up differences in understanding about the way in which the economy functions. So to see this, we'll come back to our circular flow of income diagram and develop it a little more. Here's the diagram we had before with households and firms, and we saw this circular flow that incomes are received by households from firms in exchange for the factor services that they provide. What do they do with these incomes? They spend it on goods and services which firms provide. So we've got this circular flow of income. Now, we can make this slightly more realistic by saying, as we implied last time, when households receive income, they don't actually spend it all. Of the income which they receive, some of it disappears in the form of taxes. The government takes some of it in taxation. Some of it disappears from the circular flow of income because households choose not to spend it at all, but to save it. And some of it disappears from the circular flow of income because households choose not to spend it on domestically produced goods and services, but on imports. So there are these leakages out of the circular flow of income. But at the same time, there are injections into the circular flow of income. Firms don't just receive demands from households, they also receive demands for their goods and services from investment demand, firms wanting to buy capital goods and so on. They also receive demands from governments. Governments wish to buy goods and services from firms. National Health Service bandages and so on. And one more, there is also a demand coming from firms in the form of demands for exports. Foreigners wishing to buy goods and services from our firms creates another demand. So we have three leakages out of the circular flow of income: savings, taxes and imports, and three injections into the circular flow in the form of investment, government demand and exports. Now, another way of seeing the Keynesian argument is to say that sometimes there will be an increase in these withdrawals from the circular flow of income. Savings might rise, for example, or consumers might choose to spend more on imported goods. So there is a fall in demand from firms, and when that fall in demand from firms occurs, firms reduce their output, lay off workers, and we have unemployment developing. So unemployment can develop if withdrawals from the circular flow of income exceed injections into the circular flow. The classicals say this doesn't happen. And it won't happen because markets adjust. Let's take savings, for example. Suppose households choose to save more. There's an increase in the supply of savings to the market. What does that do? It lowers interest rates. Banks find they have more funds that they need to lend out. And as the supply of savings increases, they're very keen for firms to borrow the money. So as the interest rate falls, investment rises. So whatever leaks out of the circular flow of income as increased savings, it doesn't cause a fall in the total demand for the economy because investment demand rises. Any leakage in the form of savings gets picked up in increased investment. But what about imports? Suppose we choose to import more. Doesn't that create unemployment because now we're buying less from firms in this country? Answers, say the classicals, no it doesn't. If there is an increase in import demand, it will simply reappear as export demand. How does that work? If we import more, and we'll see this in more detail when we look at the international section of the economy, if we import more, we have more of our currency appearing on the foreign exchange market to buy what we need to do the importing. That depresses the value of our currency. If the value of our currency falls, exports become cheaper. So as imports are increased, the exchange rate adjusts, exports rise. Whatever is lost from the circular flow of income in the increase in imports appears as an extra demand for firms in the form of extra exports. That simply leaves us with taxes and government expenditure. But this is determined by the government. So if the government chooses to tax households more, provided that it expends that extra taxes, there's no problem. It's the government's job to see to it that taxes are equal to government expenditure. If the government balances the budget, G will equal T and the market will stay in equilibrium. So according to the classicals, it doesn't matter what the changes in the levels of withdrawal from the circular flow of income are, it will simply adjust to the volume of injections into the circular flow. The market will see to it that there is always an appropriate volume of demand for goods and services to bring about full employment. It's not the government's job to worry about the level of unemployment in the economy. Leave the market to itself and the market will deal with any unemployment problem. It's not the government's job to worry about it. So you see this key difference between the Keynesians and the classicals revolves around how efficient the labour market is, how quickly the market responds to the appearance of unemployment in terms of the adjustment of wage rates. So that's one way we can see the difference between the classicals and the Keynesians. Now there's a second area that we need to think through now, and that's the question of inflation. Now, so far we haven't really looked at inflation, and when we looked at the Keynesian model last time, we did it focusing only on unemployment without asking the question, where does inflation fit into the picture? So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at a few ideas about the Keynesian view of inflation, and then we can begin to contrast that with the classical view, which we'll pick up more next time. Now, one way to go about doing this is to look at the market in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I spent some time looking at demand and supply curves for individual goods and services. Now we're going to look at aggregate demand, what determines the total demand for goods and services and the total supply of goods and services, and we're going to relate that to the price level. So we're going to draw this aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, which is similar in some ways to an individual good or service. We'll plot the output along the horizontal axis, but it's the output of all goods and services. And we'll plot price up the vertical axis, but this time not the price of an individual good, but the price level, some average level of prices, and ask what's the relationship between output and the price level. And we'll do it twice. We'll think about it as seen by the Keynesians, and then we'll compare that with the classical view of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, let's first of all focus on a Keynesian view of the economy using aggregate demand and supply curves, looking at not just the level of output this time, but the level of prices in the economy, whether there's inflation and so on. So to do this, we have national output along here, but notice very carefully, if you're going to make sense of this, up here we have the price level, and we're interested in the shape of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. So we have an aggregate demand curve that says the lower the price level, the more likely it is that households will spend. And according to the Keynesians, we have an aggregate supply curve, which I'll first draw and then explain, an aggregate supply curve which looks like so. I'll explain the shape in just a moment, but there's the level of national output, which has a relationship to the price level like so, and an aggregate demand curve like so. And the Keynesians say this will cause the market to adjust to the point where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply in much the same way as the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded for an individual good. So we've got the aggregate level of national output Y1 at some particular price level P1. And the Keynesians say, let's suppose the government now stimulates the economy in the way we saw last time, finds some way of increasing demand from households by way of lower taxation or whatever, and shifts the aggregate demand curve outwards so that more is bought at each price level than before. And we'll label this AD1 and this AD2. The Keynesians say, if you have a lot of unemployment in the economy and we stimulate demand, firms respond not by increasing their prices, the price level stays the same, but they do respond by increasing the level of output. Now that aggregate demand is higher and firms see their stocks running down, they respond to this fall in stocks by saying, let's meet this extra demand by raising output, not by changing prices. But now, if the government goes on stimulating the economy so that national output continues to rise, once we get somewhere near full employment and we shift aggregate demand to, let's say, AD3, firms respond again by increasing their output and producing more goods and services. But now, inflationary pressures begin to appear in the economy. And not only do we get more output, but the price level starts to rise. We get some inflation in the economy and we move up to P star. Of course, there comes a point where the economy is now fully employed. It's not possible to produce any more real output than this level of output that we could call YFE. And if the government continues to stimulate demand beyond this level, no more real output is produced. There are no more resources available. It simply has the effect of raising the price level. So in this view of the world, this Keynesian view of the world, if the government stimulates aggregate demand, they can always raise real output and therefore unemployment up to the level of full employment. But if they do it fairly near to full employment, not only will they raise real output, they will also create some inflation in the economy. So the government is going to have to trade off a little bit of inflation for a bit less unemployment and make up their minds which they think is more important. The government has to choose some optimal amount of unemployment and inflation, given the nature of the way firms react to increases in demand, given the nature of the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve. The classicals disagree with this and think that the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve diagram looks rather different. Now, in order to understand this, you have to remember what we've just said. If there's an excess supply of labour, that's to say unemployment, real wages fall. So we'll always be tending towards a level of output at which there is full employment in the economy. Maybe a short period of time when there's some unemployment, but the market will soon adjust. And so all labour that wants a job, gets a job, is fully employed, and the market is always going to that level. Now, if you think that the classicals are right, something important follows about what happens as the government stimulates the economy. And we can see it in terms of an aggregate demand curve and an aggregate supply curve as seen by the classical school. It looks like this. The aggregate supply curve is vertical. It's vertical at this level, YFE. It should be clear why. The market adjusts to the full employment level of output because of the way in which labour markets operate, as we've just seen. Now, they don't mean that YFE means that everybody in the economy has a job. There'll always be some people who haven't got a job because they're so rich they can't be bothered to work. That there are some people who are so idle that they'd rather live off Social Security handouts, and so they won't get a job either. There'll be some people who are temporarily unemployed as they move from one kind of occupation to another, but there is always a quick adjustment in the market such that those that want a job, who are actively seeking a job, can get one, and they mean full employment in that sense. It's sometimes called the level of output which represents the natural rate of unemployment, the unemployment of people who are not actively seeking a job. Now we impose our aggregate demand curve, and we have the market at the moment with a full employment level of output at some given price level that we'll call on the diagram P. Now we'll ask the question, what happens if the government chooses to stimulate the economy in some way and shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right? So AD rises from AD1 to AD2. Does it help the unemployment problem? No, that's best dealt with by the market. YFE we get anyway. What you're doing as a government now is stimulating aggregate demand, but it can't produce more output. The only thing it can do is create inflation and raise the price level to P1 or whatever, so that the effect of stimulating aggregate demand, according to the classical view, is not to help with the unemployment problem, which is best dealt with via the market. It's to create inflation in the economy, which is never good. So here we've got some differences between the Keynesians and the classicals as to the way in which the economy functions with regard to unemployment, and therefore what is the appropriate government response to the problem when unemployment appears. Classical view, do nothing, the market will take care of it. Keynesian view, manipulate the volume of aggregate demand to bring about a full employment level of output. So that's one of the key differences between the Keynesians and the classical school. Now, there was a time when most economists were classical and believed that this was correct, that the classical view of the market was the correct one. And then Keynes came along and argued that this wasn't the case. And there was a period where economists became largely Keynesian. And one of the things that helped to convince them that the Keynesian view of the world was correct was what became known as the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve was named after an economist, A.W. Phillips, who came up with some interesting evidence about the relationship between unemployment and inflation. A relationship which he said wasn't consistent with the classical view of the world, but was consistent with a Keynesian view of the world. So let's have a look at what the Phillips curve showed. The Phillips curve shows the relationship between the level of unemployment along here, which we usually express in percentage terms, 0% here, 1%, 2, 3, 4%, and so on. So as we move along here, we're increasing the level of unemployment in the economy as a percentage. And up here, we plot the rate of change of money wages in the course of the year. To what extent do people's wages rise in money terms? You understand that a real wage increase would be when wages rise by more than the increase in the price level. If wages go up by 5% and prices by 5%, there's no change in real wages, but there's been a 5% change in money wages. So up here we're asking, what's the rate of change of money wages? And when Phillips, over a long period of time, plotted the relationship, and this is not a theory, this is what he actually observed. And he said, let's look at one particular year. And in that year, we observed that there was a 2% level of unemployment and a 2% rate of change of money wages. There's a spot on the picture. And in another year, we had 4% unemployment and a 1% rate of change of money wages. That's another spot on the picture. So for every year, we can plot a spot which relates the rate of change of money wages in that year to the level of unemployment. And then he said, if we draw a fit through these spots, it's clear that there is a relationship, something like that. What does this show us? It shows us that if we have a lot of unemployment in the economy, there is very little increase in money wages, Or to put it another way, we won't have much inflation. Or you can have an economy with very little unemployment, but if you do that, you tend to find that there's a high rate of change of money wages, which is probably going to be inflationary. So you have to trade off unemployment with inflation. Now, I had a theory as to why that relationship held. He said you can't argue with that in the sense that this is not a theory. We're just looking at evidence. It's just the way the world is. But he came up with a theory as to why it's like that. And he did it in terms of trade union power. He said, when you have lots of unemployment, trade unions are not in a strong position to press for increases in wage levels. If they try it, firms say, no, if you won't work for this amount of money, there are plenty of other people out there who will. But where there's a very small pool of unemployed labour, trades unions come along and ask for a wage increase, and employers know that they really don't have much alternative but to give in, because it's so difficult for them to find alternative sources of labour supply. So when there's a lot of unemployment, firms find it easy to keep wage increases down. When there's not much unemployment, they don't. And so you get this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So, say the Keynesians, governments can determine the level of unemployment in the economy by manipulating the volume of demand, although we have to recognize that there comes a point where, when they do it, they may create some inflation in the economy. They've got to choose which they want, operate some kind of trade-off. It was very difficult for the classicals to respond to this when there seemed to be evidence supporting the Keynesian case. But after a time, the classicals came up with a response to this and now argue that the classical view is correct even in the light of this evidence. How do they do that? What's the classical response to this? And the best way to do it is to see it in terms of the diagram. So we're going back to the Phillips curve here, and we're going to see the classical view of the Phillips curve. And the classical view goes like this. The Keynesians are correct that there is a very short-term trade-off between the level of unemployment and inflation, which looks like this. But it's very deceptive, and it doesn't suggest that the Keynesians are right with regard to their policies. Let's start off with imagine an economy to illustrate how the classicals think of the world. Let's start off with some level of unemployment here. It might be, let's say, 8%. And we have no inflation in the economy at all, a zero rate of change of money wages, a zero level of price change. And then the Keynesian government decides to try to get the level of unemployment down below 8%, which they do by stimulating the economy in some way, and they appear to be successful. Because they've stimulated the economy now, unemployment falls, and they manage to reduce the level of unemployment in the economy to 6%, but they do it at a cost. And we'll say that the cost is that they've created some inflation of, let's say, 9%. And it may be that the Keynesians say, yes, we know there is a trade-off of this kind, but we think it's worth it. We can buy less unemployment even at the cost of some inflation. The classicals say, this appears to be successful, but it's wrong. It won't work. And the reason they say this appears to be successful is that in the very short term, it does work. They say that when the government stimulates the economy in this way, wage rates rise and so does the price level, but wage rates rise before prices catch up. So there comes a time when it appears that the workers now have a higher real wage than before. Prices haven't gone up yet, wage rates have gone up, and some people who would not work at the current level of real wages are induced to come into the market by the higher real wages. They appear in the labour market. Unemployment seems to fall to 6%, albeit after a while the price level rises. When the price level rises, these workers say, well, then there is no real increase in our wage rates. It's only a money thing. Prices have gone up by as much as wages. We're not being offered any more in real terms. Let's go back onto the dole and go back to being unemployed. So they leave the labour market, and we now have an economy with 9% inflation and as much unemployment as before. Now you can see what's going to happen now. The government may say, well, we can still get unemployment down by further stimulating the economy. But if they create 9% inflation in the economy now, Labour will say, yes, we've seen this before. It's not an increase in real wages, only money wages. No, we're not tempted. But if the government stimulates the economy even more and creates, say, a 15% increase in the price level and an increase of 15% in wages, these people may be fooled back into the labour market temporarily until they realise that prices are going up just as fast as wages. They then leave in disappointment the labour market, except we now have as much unemployment as we had before, but this time we've got 15% inflation. So in the short term, you can buy, just for a while, lower unemployment by creating inflation. But in the longer term, the level of unemployment is fixed at this natural rate. You either have to choose 8% with zero inflation or 8% at 10, 15, 20% inflation. There is no trade-off in the long run. So again, we have a difference between the classical and the Keynesian school. And again, it's the way in which the labour market functions which is the key to understanding these differences. Both are perfectly consistent theories with their own assumptions. The difference is in the assumptions that are being made with regard to how the labour market works. Now, just to finish then, let's look at what this implies about policy. We'll develop this more next time, but we can already pick up some differences with regard to how Keynesians and classicals believe that we should deal with the problem of unemployment and inflation in the economy. Let's take the Keynesians first. There's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. We can get unemployment down, albeit at a cost of more inflation. It's up to the government to choose what's the optimum combination. Classical view, there is no such long-run trade-off. It's a very short-term trade-off. We should ignore that. We shall allow the market to adjust, and the market will quickly adjust to some level of unemployment which represents the natural rate of unemployment. So what should the government do about unemployment if I have a classical view of the world? Nothing, except to make markets work as efficiently as possible. Labour markets work as efficiently as possible. Maybe there are some people who won't work because they'd rather do nothing and live on unemployment benefits. So we could lower the natural rate of unemployment by reducing Social Security handouts, and the natural rate of unemployment would be lower. There may be other policies that we can undertake to make labour markets work more efficiently, reduce the power of trades unions to prevent real wages from falling. The way we approach the problem, if we're classicals, is to say, the market does it. We must make sure that the market works as effectively as possible. Whereas the Keynesians say, the market doesn't do it very well. We need governments involved in controlling unemployment because the market doesn't work efficiently. The other thing which the classicals say, and I just want to introduce you to this in the last minute or so, and we'll pick this up more next time. The other thing which becomes essential in the classical view of the world, as we've seen, is that it is essential for governments to balance the budget. We saw that S will tend to equal I if we leave it to the market. We saw that X will tend to equal M if we leave it to the market. It's crucial that the government balances its budget and makes G equal to T. It's even more than that. Not only must G be equal to T, but it must be that at a low level of T. If we have lots of government spending and lots of taxes, the problem is that these high taxes destroy incentives to work, as we've seen in our micro. So in order to keep the economy operating efficiently, we have to have a low level of taxation. And that means a low level of government expenditure because G will always have to equal T. Whereas the Keynesians say, no. There are periods of the economy when we have a lot of unemployment, and the appropriate thing to do then is to stimulate the economy, lower taxes, more government spending and so on. That may well therefore necessitate government spending G being much higher than T. We may have to run a deficit in government spending. That's fine. It's a necessary part of keeping the economy close to full employment. So another key difference, and we'll pick this up and run with it more next time, another key difference between the Keynesians and the classicals is the government's budgetary position. Is it appropriate for governments to have periods of time when they spend more than they receive in taxes? Keynesian view, absolutely. Classical view, no. G must always equal to T. So we've reached a point where we've seen some differences between the two schools of thinking with regard to unemployment and some differences with regard to inflation. But there are some key ideas about what actually causes inflation in a market system, which the classicals have, that we haven't taken account of yet. And to do that, we need to understand the role of money in the economy, and it's to that that we'll turn in the next lecture.